Why would God no longer drive out the peoples of Canaan from before Israel? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Judges on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to be discussing Judges 2 verses 1 to 10, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to Judges chapter 2 verse 1, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Judges chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. So it was, when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. Then they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. And when Joshua had dismissed the people, the children of Israel went each to his own inheritance to possess the land. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. Now Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died when he was 110 years old. And they buried him within the borders of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gaash. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done for Israel. We have spent the last 3 lessons looking at what the children of Israel did after the death of Joshua. Joshua died about 25 years after Israel settled in Canaan. During that time, Israel was to continue driving out the Canaanites, for God did say he would not do so at once. But for whatever reason, whether it was a lack of faith or sheer laziness or both, Israel did not complete the mission by the death of Joshua. After Joshua's death, there was a drive to continue the job, but even that fell short. In fact, according to our map, before the days of the Judges, Israel had largely ceded her coast to the Canaanites, thus cutting off or reducing any access and benefit that they might have wanted or gained from the Mediterranean Sea. Coming now to chapter 2, we have the Lord's response. In verse 1, we have the angel of the Lord mentioned. In our Old Testament studies, we often have seen the angel of the Lord talked about, and from the context have determined that what we have is God speaking. He did so to Hagar in the wilderness in Genesis 16. He did so to Abraham in the mountains of Moriah in Genesis 22. He did so to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3. And he did so to Balaam on the way to Moab in Numbers 22. This does not mean that every time we see angel of the Lord that it is referring to God, but the context should tell us. Angel simply means messenger, and so when it refers to God, it simply means that he is his own messenger. But angel could also refer to the heavenly beings we so often associate with the word angel. Again, the context will be our guide in determining what is meant. And from Judges 2, angel of the Lord is clearly talking about God. It was God who led Israel up out of Egypt, and it was God who made a covenant with Israel's fathers, namely Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't break that covenant. In fact, he preserved Israel for over 600 years by this point in order to keep his covenant. Israel, though, had a responsibility of her own, not to make covenants with the inhabitants of Canaan, nor were they to keep their altars, for God wasn't only giving Israel the land of Canaan, he was punishing the Canaanites for their sin and using Israel to accomplish his purpose. Knowing that the Canaanites were being destroyed for sin, why then would Israel want to live among the peoples that God got so angry at? But alas, Israel did make covenants with these peoples, like they did with Gibeon in Joshua 9. And yes, they didn't tear down the altars that the Canaanites used. Because of Israel's disobedience in this regard, God said that he would not drive out the peoples of Canaan any further, but would allow them to be thorns in Israel's side and their gods to be a snare for Israel. Was God breaking his promise to Israel? No, in fact, he was keeping the promises he made to Israel in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 as to what would happen to them if they disobeyed him. Joshua warned Israel of this fact in Joshua 23:12 and 13, but alas, Joshua is now dead, and Israel didn't complete the mission. So God was going to make good on his promise and allow Israel to reap what it sowed. When the Lord had said this, Israel lifted up their voices and wept, which is why they called the place that they did so Bochim, which literally means weeping. Bochim is near Gilgal, which itself is near Jericho. They even sacrificed to the Lord there, but the Lord's mind was made up, and Israel would have to live with their choices. And my, the sorrow that would come because of their choices, for that's what the rest of Judges will teach us. Coming now to verses 6 to 10, we have yet another section of Judges that is not in chronological order, but is placed here in order to set up the next section. What we have for us is a repetition of the death of Joshua that we discussed in our lesson in Joshua 24, verses 29 to 31. That lesson can be found on our YouTube channel under the Walking Through the Bible Joshua playlist. The reason we can know that this is an insertion and not simply a continuation of chapter 2 in Judges is because verse 6 is a reference to Joshua 24, verse 28, an event that occurred in Shechem, not Bochim. In Joshua 24, verse 28, it leads us right into verses 29 to 31 and the account of Joshua's death there, showing us that the writer of Judges is largely quoting the end of Joshua here in Judges 2 in order to set up the period of the Judges which is to follow. The attitude of God in verses 1 to 5 compared to verses 6 to 10 would also confirm this. For in verses 1 to 5, God is angry with Israel for their disobedience. Yet in verse 7 it says that Israel served God all the days of Joshua and the elders from the time of Joshua who outlived Joshua. It was only after those elders were dead that Israel turned from God. If Israel was serving God in verses 1 to 5 because Joshua was still alive, why would he be so angry with them? And the answer to that is he wouldn't, showing us here that the writer of Judges inserted this part from the end of Joshua in order to set up the narrative that follows. We'll continue on with chapter 2, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Judges chapter 2, verses 11 to 23. So we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.